Division and delay at the UN as the world tries to work out exactly what message or demand it wants to make of Israel. Politics inside the country continues as ever. And we'll hear from a national treasure here in Britain who took an unexpected stand. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Brief disclaimer, this might be a slightly shorter episode than usual because one of the co-hosts is in their pajamas drinking tea and one of us is English. So just a short way of telling you that I fractured my shoulder this week. I fell down the stairs. Important lesson to all you unholy listeners, look where you're going. And so under a substantial amount of painkillers, might have some trouble connecting adjectives to nouns. But as my co-host likes to say, such is my commitment to Unholy that I'm attempting to do it this way.
Well, completely. It's an act of ridiculous, heroism on your part. You didn't have to do this. The listeners and I would have given you a pass for this week. You had a doctor's note, big time, but you're forging ahead, pressing ahead. Anyway, and so it's you get credit just for being here, just for showing up. Yonit, how is the shoulder as we speak right now?
Not great. I have a doctor's note from the emergency room. That's a very shiny doctor's note. But yeah, I mean, so much else is going on that I will let go of my personal issues now, and we will continue talking about the rest of what is going on, but definitely not. I'll just say that when it rains, it pours. That was my feeling this week.
It really does. Like you don't have enough to deal with in the last months of 2023. This has come along. Well, we talk about news that never stops. I mean, in this case, the news out of New York has not quite materialized, let alone not stopped. It's been a waiting game with diplomats and reporters and others waiting for the United Nations Security Council to debate a resolution in some form or other calling for a ceasefire and trying to come up with language that the United States in particular can live with. There were some sort of smoke signals suggesting there was some language, and then it appeared that formulation was fine with the State Department, but not with Joe Biden's White House. And that is a split that is played out over decades where there is a slightly more, you don't want to say left of center, but more moderate, more sort of dovish, whatever word you want to use, on lots of issues, actually, but on Israel-Palestine out of the State Department historically, with often presidents in the White House holding the line. Last week, you and I, when you had your conversation with Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, we talked about where exactly the US administration is on this issue. And the signs are that Joe Biden is still holding firm in his support for Israel to the extent that he is even standing up to, as it were, his own State Department, as well as the other 4 permanent members of the Security Council, in not green-lighting a resolution that would be, too demanding, as he would see it, and certainly as Israel would see it, on Israel. So as yet, no language, lots of back and forth internationally, a couple of European leaders floating this phrase, sustainable ceasefire, which when you look at it closely sort of means a ceasefire where everything is resolved and everything done and Israel is content. And people, point out, well, that could be months away. So is that really meaningful? It's a big argument about language, but what it comes down to is that old question we've talked about, how long exactly does the international community and Washington in particular give Israel?
Yeah, and I think if one thing was clear from that interview with Jake Sullivan, U.S. National Security Advisor, what he is saying is, again, this war against Hamas is going to be a long war. He even singled out the heads of Hamas in Gaza that need to be assassinated by Israel. I mean, he basically said it when, I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, he did name the names. There is an argument about this high intensity stage and how long it should last. Again, the calls for ceasefire never give a good enough answer to Israel for the pressing question after October 7th, which is, And then what? If you're suggesting that Israel lives next to the devil that did this to this country once and says it will do it again and again, and also with the same breath say ceasefire, then what are you actually suggesting? Which is a big question. What is on the table from the Israeli perspective is, of course, another sort of period of a cessation of violence to release more hostages. That is the conversation going on now between Israel, Qatar, and the United States, who are very involved in this, trying to get out more Israeli hostages. We know that it blew apart last time because Israel demanded to release the remaining women held by Hamas. Hamas didn't want to do that. The whole world finally realized what that meant. Now the categories have been, according to reports, been expanded to say that Hamas will release something between 30 to 40 Israeli hostages, which will include women, the injured, and older men. Hamas, always a participant in psychological warfare, also released a video of 3 older men in captivity to sort of pressure the Israeli public, but definitely as is the Israeli public all know more and more on what these hostages have been going through, it's of course very much the interest of Israel to release them as quickly as possible, 76 days into this war.
And just on that point about the broadcast of the video message, did Israeli networks broadcast that hostage video, or did they hold back?
Look, generally speaking, there is no handbook on how to deal with what we have been dealing with and the dilemmas of what to air and what not when Hamas is putting out this kind of warfare. Generally, what we have decided to do, and we're pretty much sticking to it, is not to show the video in its entirety. Because what they usually do is they force the hostages to say certain things. And so we don't show the video, but we do take a sort of a screenshot of them because it's important also for their families to know this is a sign of life from them. But we don't play the whole thing so as not to play along with Hamas's psychological warfare. You can argue about this, obviously, in the age of social media, if you should do this or not, but this is what we have been doing throughout these 2.5 months.
Yeah, no, I also just because I think a lot of people are interested in how the war is seen. Each aspect of it is seen to viewers in Israel. It makes good sense that you wouldn't want to be carrying messages which are in effect aimed at, psychological effects and propaganda. I mean, on the point about the diplomatic deliberations and whether or not any kind of cessation can be brokered, 2 events that happened since you and I last spoke that form part of this diplomatic environment. The first is, in terms of pressure on Israel to ceasefire, is this milestone, and people knew it was coming, of Hamas via the health ministry in Gaza saying that the milestone of 20,000 dead had been passed. You and I on this podcast have often made a point of saying how many of those will actually be Hamas men, armed men, rather than, as I think the figure is often understood outside, being civilians. It could be anything between 7, 8, 9,000 of that 20,000 that could be Hamas fighters, and therefore that puts a different gloss on it. But that has added
Israel's version is usually a third of something around the third of that number.
So that would be around the 7,000 mark. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, that milestone figure of 20,000 is added to that pressure. Joe Biden feels it from within his own party. It's definitely there in Western capitals, which says in a very simple, some would say simplistic way, enough people have died, the fighting has gone on too long, just stop. There's that pressure on a lot of political leaders. And then on the other hand, completely different kind of pressure, but also in favor of pausing, is from hostage families in Israel saying, we fear for our loved ones as long as this bombardment or fighting is continuing. Please stop in order to make it more possible for them to get out. And that, or to be, for there to be some kind of release. And that pressure got louder again after you and I spoke at the end of last week with this supremely tragic development, which, why don't you tell us, Yonit, what people will know what happened, but you tell us how that, what happened and what the aftermath of that was.
Yeah, I mean, it's definite that this week, all of it is conducted under the shadow of the 3 Israeli hostages being shot dead tragically by Israeli soldiers. It happened in Sajaiya on Friday. They were held for 70 days, and they managed to somehow release themselves. When you go through this terrible, it's just a tragedy of errors, really. A litany of mistakes, one after the other. They did everything right. Now we know that, first of all, they were shot accidentally by Israeli soldiers, even though they were walking with a white flag. Also, another thing that is known is that they tried to actually put out a sign where they were held captive, saying in Hebrew, there are hostages here. So that is also a point. We now know also that they were recorded on an IDF's camera, on a canine, but that wasn't checked. I mean, everything in this story is just a terrible tragedy. You think about the fact that these heroic 3 Israelis managed to actually run away from the people who were holding them captive. And the end of this story is the fact that they were shot dead by Israeli soldiers. The mother of Yotam Chaim recorded a message to the soldiers yesterday saying, I'm not angry, I'm not upset at you. I know that you're under tremendous pressure and I love you, which really is just the most amazing. Just think of what this woman went through and what she's managed to do. I mean, this is really a terrible story in a very long period of many terrible stories.
I mean, just a few things about that. Some of the detail that's been coming out is extraordinary. You've mentioned some of it, but this sign that they did, I think they had to stain made the letters by using food to sort of stain the sheet to send the message. You mentioned the canine. I don't know whether everyone gets that. That literally means a camera strapped to a dog that went into one of these houses and filmed the hostages speaking, saying we're here, and yet no one monitored that feed. I mention that partly because a story from October the 7th itself was the failures of intelligence and military failures. And we've always said there will be a huge inquest afterwards. I just wonder if this adds to that sense that there are still questions to answer, even ongoing, during this conflict, about the degree of sort of competence in the IDF and in intelligence when you've got a feed like that and people just aren't looking at it. I asked that question. But just on the sort of fallout of it, I've certainly heard, families of hostages, and there always was this tension between the two objectives. On the one hand, defeat Hamas, degrade them, prevent them being a viable fighting force on the one hand. On the other objective of this war, get the hostages out. And there are hostage families, and they're there in Hostages Square opposite the Defense Ministry, who are saying, stop, ceasefire only so that we can start talking and get our loved ones home. And that oddly is, they are on a lot of international media because that chimes with some of the diplomatic pressure in this country coming from a very different direction. We can agree. Also saying ceasefire, but it has a huge moral authority when you have on the BBC and other places hostage families saying, we too have had enough for completely different reasons. We don't think you can simultaneously bombard Gaza and make it safe for our loved ones. And so there's pressure from outside on the Israeli government and from inside.
Right. We should say that the hostages' families are saying you can continue this war after. They're not saying stop the war,
absolutely,
but they are saying the first priority here is to get our loved ones out. We understand what they're going through. Every day is an eternity there. Just get them out. And you're right that this has become a much more prominent voice after this tragedy in Sujaiya. And the government is going to have a very hard time trying to continue to convince Israelis, but the war is actually putting pressure on Hamas, which is what they have been saying for a while now.
Yeah. And this, of course, is the subject already of an inquiry, but the firing on people without shirts and with waving a white flag has raised questions about what the rules of engagement are, because obviously, under conventional rules, you wouldn't be firing at people waving a white flag without shirts. We know that Hamas is not a conventional enemy in any way and do not themselves respect any kind of rules of war. But that too is a question, an uncomfortable one, being asked of Israel. I anticipate the response that some people might say to that, I too do notice that plenty of people who are now criticizing on this ground have suddenly found it in them to be upset and worried about the plight of hostages. Now with these three, they're concerned, having not really ever mentioned hostages before. Now they're saying it because they're using it to raise questions about Israel's rules of engagement. Nevertheless, I think there are real questions there to answer about how it came to be. We get the fact it was a terrible error, but how it came to be that somebody thought it was okay to fire on people shirtless and waving the white flag.
Yeah, I mean, what the soldiers themselves are saying, that they did confirm that they saw a white cloth. They said that they didn't have time to make sense of the situation. I'll tell you this, Jonathan. I I did my military service, not in a combat unit. I did go to firing exercises every month, so I did hold a gun every once in a while. But I really have a hard time trying to understand what's going through the mind of a 19-year-old soldier that's been in Gaza for 70 days, seeing their friends killed or wounded, knowing that death lurks everywhere, knowing there are terrorists over everywhere. The ground could open up under their feet and reveal a Hamas tunnel. So I feel a little bit uneasy judging them, but I agree that there are very, very tough questions to be asked about what happened there. It's a very fine line to walk, but there should be questions asked about this incident, particularly because it ended in really such a terrible way.
Yeah, I mean, it's an impossible situation all round. It does add to what I mentioned before, there are domestic pressures, meaning that politics in Israel does not stop and has not stopped, even though the country is at war.
Yes. Look, there is a poll that's a very interesting one that we published on Channel 12 this week that I sort of want to go through it. Maybe it's a little bit granular, but I think it's important to understand where we are and where the trends are, and we've seen this for a while. We should say, first of all, that in the polls, the main question is always, if the elections were held today, which party would you vote for? So Netanyahu's Likud continuing to be very, very low in this poll, 18 seats. We will remind our listeners that the current Likud has 32 seats. Benny Gantz's National Unity Party at 37 in this poll. Again, today in the Knesset, they have 12 seats. So this, and maybe we should just zoom out on that and remind our listeners that Israeli prime ministers during a war tend to be very popular in the polls, even if they're toppled after. So that includes Ehud Olmert during the Second Lebanon War. That includes Golda Meir during the Yom Kippur War. Netanyahu is incredibly unpopular here. And when you take the question that is who is suitable to be prime minister, you see Benny Gantz opening up even a bigger gap than he had. He's 45%, Netanyahu is 27%. The interesting name in that questionnaire was Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister and a very, let's say, a rival to Netanyahu. The same question, who's suitable to be prime minister at this time? Bennett got 33% and Netanyahu got 29%. I'm going to add just one more question, and then I want to say something else that's pretty interesting. Another question that we asked is, do you support passing over the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority after the war? 54% were against, 19% support it, 27% don't know. Now, why is this important? Because it shows you that there is a growing gap between the Israeli right. Israel is moving to the right because of this war, but they're not moving with Benjamin Netanyahu. And that is an interesting development that should be pointed out, I think, when you read the details of this poll.
It really is interesting that high number opposing Palestinian Authority involvement in Gaza the day after. That will come as disappointing news to the Joe Biden White House. Jake Sullivan, in his interview with you last week, said a revitalized, revamped PA is more or less the only option they can see for taking over Gaza. And there's the Israeli electorate via your poll saying not so much.
Yeah, but can I make a point about that?
Yeah.
First of all, this has been Netanyahu pushing this point over and over the last couple of weeks. Second, just to be the voice of logic here, no one actually thinks that this will pass to the Palestinian Authority a day after the war. it's clear even to the Biden administration and to the Israelis and to everyone that there would be an interim period in which there will be some sort of security element of Israel inside the Gaza Strip. No one talks about automatically passing this on. What this means is, Jonathan, that people are listening to Netanyahu's message being hammered over and over, but they're not listening to him. That, I think, is the interesting part of this question.
Yeah, I think the notion that the country is going rightward but not with him is fascinating and laid bare by that poll. I think Naftali Bennett will be very pleased by that number, given that even when he was prime minister, he was there with just a tiny party, 6 seats, I think, in his own party. Mm-hmm. And there he is getting 1 in 3 Israelis saying he's, passes the suitability test for prime minister. You can see in all of this why Benjamin Netanyahu is very keen to postpone his date with the electorate, because it looks like irreversibly bad news for him. That means he has an interest in keeping this war going as long as possible, because it keeps him still in that seat, which he needs to be given his legal woes. There are plenty of people worried by that who think it's these political calculations, it's these poll numbers that are weighing on his military strategic decisions in a way they shouldn't for somebody who is meant to be acting as a war leader. So that, if people wanted a change of heart from the prime minister or to be acting in a different way, your poll that your network has carried is not going to make that happen anytime soon, I don't think.
Yeah, I'll just make a few brief notes and stop me when this begins to bore you. But I will say that we did float around 3 interesting names into this poll. One is, of course, Naftali Bennett himself, said to be contemplating returning into the political arena. Yossi Cohen, the former head of Mossad, and everyone tends to think he's more to the right. And of course, Yair Golan being the name to unite the Israeli left. He's the retired general, one of those that took up a gun and went down south on October 7th and helped fight the fight. Just to say that if these people are all in the arena, then it's interesting to say that Naftali Bennett would get, a party headed by Naftali Bennett would get 13 seats, Yossi Cohen 9 seats, and Yair Golan 11 seats. By the way, in the current poll, in this current situation, Bezalel Smotrich doesn't pass the electoral threshold without these 3 names that I mentioned. And the only party in the coalition that does grow a little bit in power is Itamar Ben-Gvir's party of Jewish power. So all this is very, very interesting. As you said, and I think you accurately put your finger on this, Netanyahu does not want elections. He will try and buy time in any way possible, but you will start seeing cracks. You might see Benny Gantz leaving this government. You might see Bezalel Smotrich realizing that he might not have a political future leaving this government. So all this points to the fact that we might be seeing elections in Israel pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, just a few reactions there. Yair Golan, I did see him in action last month and was obviously struck by the possibility of him as being a new leader of the left. He was in the Knesset for the Meretz parties. He's not new to politics, but we've talked about the exit of Labour's leader, Merav Michaeli. There's a vacancy there. Can you imagine a new structure that somehow combines Labour, Meretz, and coalesces the Israeli left under Yair Golan? I think it's plausible. And your poll will add to that. 11 seats is not, revolutionary, but maybe that's but it's still more than they've got right now. And that would be a base to build on. So I think that is a striking number. You mentioned the former Mossad head, Yossi Cohen. I think there'll be Likud people thinking, well, there is an alternative leader there to Netanyahu. If Netanyahu does go, Cohen is there. And of course, there will be people alarmed, I think, by hearing of Ben-Gvir's success. I think lots of people would have wanted to see the back of him, but that's not likely. And in a way is a reward, and Smotrich will be thinking this, it's something of a reward for Ben-Gvir's strategy of distancing himself somewhat from this government and from the leadership of the war, but also the leadership that, as he and others might formulate it, allowed October the 7th to happen through their own failures. He likes being an oppositional figure. He has positioned himself oppositionally from the start, and Smotrich has not, as I understand it, in quite the same way. And therefore there is, if you are on the right and in opposition mode, Ben Gvir looks like the receptacle in a way that Smotrich does not. So I think your poll bears out, in a way, the strategic choices some of these people have taken.
Yeah, I think the fact that Smotrich is the finance minister and has been, in the eyes of many Israelis, deaf to the requests not to move millions of shekels as coalition funding to the ultra-Orthodox and to religious Zionism, but actually to move it to the war effort, I think that is hurting him very much in the polls. He looks like he appears to many Israelis to be like a finance minister that's only worried about his own coalition and his parts of his base and not to the general public. I think that is hurting him a lot in the polls.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And the anger among the displaced people. I mean, huge numbers of people displaced from both the south and north of the country, living in temporary accommodation, and their fury at seeing that they are still going without some basics, apart from those provided by volunteers. Meanwhile, the ultra-Orthodox, already the beneficiaries of huge state largesse, getting even more under Smotrich and Netanyahu. So that dissent is all building up for the next election. I do wonder at what point Benny Gantz thinks, look, these polls are not going to stay like this forever. At some point, I do have to, as it were, cash in my chips. But maybe he's not going to do that until this phase of the war is over and he can exit the war cabinet.
Well, he was pretty clear on saying the first intense stage of the war will be over. The reservists come home. That's when we're going to start thinking about leaving the coalition. So that can be pretty soon. What will probably happen is that his partner, remember this National Unity Party was set as two parties came together. It was Benny Gantz's party and Gideon Sa'ar's party. And more, Sa'ar used to be a member of the Likud, then he turned rival on Netanyahu, he left the Likud. More and more people are saying that actually Sa'ar might break away and he will stay with the coalition and not go with Benny Gantz, but actually come closer to Netanyahu. Netanyahu is basically trying to pull him back into the Likud. All of this proves that there is a lot of politics going on under the surface, and even not completely, not as subtext, but actually as text, while Israel is still fighting this war.
Yeah, and we will keep watching it here on Unholy. We're going to keep our eye on it even as we move into the final days of this year and into next. Long-time listeners will have noticed that we put on pause our tradition of awards at the end of each podcast for Mensch and for Chutzpah. It didn't feel quite right. That may be coming back pretty soon. But if we were still doing Mensch and Chutzpah, I think we've probably covered some of the candidates just in our most recent bit of our conversation. But if we were doing Mensch, obviously a mention at the very least goes to you for your extraordinary indefatigability and vigor in managing to come on the podcast, Yonit, even with your injury. But I think another candidate would be here where I am in Britain. And I'll fill this in just a little bit by saying, some people may have noticed that a festival is approaching in a few days, celebrated by people who aren't Jewish, and some Jews too, actually. The usual way that is marked in Britain is that at 3:00 on Christmas Day, on the 25th of December, the monarch delivers a Christmas message. And Channel 4, which thinks of itself as a kind of plucky insurgent network in this country, always had an alternative Christmas message. Someone else would give up and broadcast a message at the same time as the Queen, or now King Charles, was doing theirs. This year, that honour fell to the actor, writer, and sort of all-round national treasure, Stephen Fry, known to many people for his association with the Harry Potter books. He is the voice behind 7 of the Harry Potter audiobooks. Stephen Fry.
Who are these people? Please tell me most people know him for a lot of other reasons.
Yeah, I think there are. In fact, you might know, because as a student of this genre.
I'm sorry, I'm the kid who grew up on a bit of Fry and Laurie on BBC Prime. So you're barking down the wrong tree here.
Okay.
I've been a longtime fan of Stephen Fry from a completely different zone.
So Stephen Fry, extremely well loved and popular. He's giving this year's alternative Christmas message, and it shows him at the beginning putting up sort of seasonal decorations, but then it takes an unexpected turn. He says that many years ago, he thought that he was going to face a life of loneliness because he's gay, and that he would be, the exclusion, exile, and disgrace would be the fate of somebody with his sexuality. And no, it hasn't turned out that way. There is acceptance. But there isn't acceptance for, he says, another part of his identity. And he turns to the camera and says, I am Stephen Fry and I am a Jew. And he says it a couple of times and says that may surprise you. It even surprises me. Talks a little bit about his background and then takes a stand on the current upsurge in anti-Semitism in Britain and around the world. Shop windows smashed, he said. Stars of David and swastikas daubed on walls of Jewish properties, synagogues and cemeteries. There is real fear stalking the Jewish neighborhoods of Britain, he says. And he then urges people, viewers, to speak up and stand with Jewish people. I think it's a really brave thing of him to have done, not because there will be a backlash, and there already has been. Horrible, vile stuff has come his way on social media, but because he didn't need to do this. He's a very popular actor. He could have just kept his head down. He did not need to join this fight or align himself with it. And yet he has. And I think when people do that, when they take some kind of stand that they didn't have to take and they made a move they didn't have to make, I think they deserve our recognition. So if we were handing out awards, Stephen Fry, I think, would be a good candidate for this week's Mensch Award.
Not arguing with you at all. And as I said, I think, he has talent enough for 10 people. And the amazing thing about it is, right, that he's saying it's time for Jews to stand up right and to be proud in face of this barrage of anti-Semitism that has been unleashed. And he immediately comes under attack and a barrage of anti-Semitism unleashed on him. By the way, those attacking him only proving his point, right? But I agree completely. And I think that if we were returning our Mensch Awards, he deserves the Mensch Award of the week for sure.
We will be back, Shouldergate permitting. That's the the scandal they're already calling Shouldergate. Normally we thank everyone else involved, but I'm going to thank you, Yonit, for managing to somehow fight through the medication and the pain and do Unholy for this week. So all plaudits to you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. We will say our thank yous to Gaia Glaser, Omer Primat. Special thanks to Omri Barak. And I hope we'll meet next week, Jonathan.
I hope so too. Get well.